Imagine this. When was the last time you had a conversation with your partner that left you feeling truly understood and connected? Take your time to reflect on that. In today's fast paced world where it's very easy to get caught up in the hustle and the bustle of our life, or what I would call our busy lives, how often do we prioritize engaging in a deep, meaningful, intellectual conversation with our spouse? Welcome to Heartfelt Connections Podcast. I'm your host, Janet Adetunji, your relationship, sex, and intimacy coach, guiding you on this journey through the twists and turns of love, marriage, and meaningful connections centered on faith. In our previous episode, we talked about intimacy being more than just sex. There's several types of intimacy: spiritual, sexual, intellectual, and emotional. We will be deep diving into each of those types in no particular order of priority during our Deepening Intimacy series. Last episode, we talked about building emotional intimacy, what it is, what are some of the hindrances, and how do we cultivate it. So if you haven't listened to that podcast, please take some time to do so. In today's episode of Deepening Intimacy, we'll explore the concept of intellectual intimacy and how it plays a crucial role in deepening the connection between you and your partner. We'll discuss what intellectual intimacy truly means, why is it important, what are the hindrances to cultivating it, and discover some practical ways to strengthen it. My goal today is to guide you to creating lasting bonds with your spouse. Let's start with what intellectual intimacy truly means. The way I see intellectual intimacy is, it is about connecting on a mental level, sharing your ideas and your thoughts, and engaging in meaningful conversations with your spouse. It's like having a deep friendship where both of you stimulate each other's mind. This kind of intimacy, to me, I believe is crucial because it helps strengthen the foundation for understanding and appreciating each other's perspective. That can help bring you closer. It can also foster mutual respect between both of you. In a sustainable marriage, intellectual intimacy keeps the relationship very vibrant. It helps you grow together and continually learning from one another and supporting each other's perspective and pursuits. It's like having a partner who not only knows your heart, but also your mind. So how do you know if you lack intellectual intimacy in your marriage? Well, when there's a lack of intellectual intimacy in a marriage, partners may feel disconnected or misunderstood. Sometimes they struggle to engage in meaningful conversations or even find common ground on important topics. When this happens, it can lead to a feeling of boredom or loneliness or even resentment because you can't seem to be on the same page or even agree to disagree. Without stimulating each other intellectually, the relationship becomes almost stagnant. You might begin to feel like you're drifting apart because you can't have a conversation. The absence of intellectual intimacy can also hinder problem solving. And I've seen this a lot because a lot of time you try to make decisions or you try to solve a problem, but because you cannot communicate with each other or stimulate each other intellectually, then the problem remains unsolved. The decision-making process becomes stagnant because there is lack of collaboration or you're not thinking or sharing your ideas. Overall, that relationship may just end up feeling shallow or unfulfilled, making it very challenging to maintain long-term relationships or happiness because all you end up doing is, as an example, when you start a decision-making process, because you cannot stimulate each other intellectually, you also cannot understand each other's perspective, or it gets to a point where you begin to feel like, am I dumb? Is he dumb? Is she dumb? Those questions begin to come up. And so these are the issues that you begin to see when there's a lack of intellectual intimacy in a relationship. So, what are some hindrances to cultivating intellectual intimacy? I would say one that is very, very obvious is busy schedules, right? When both partners are caught up in their individual routine and responsibility, it can be challenging to find time to actually have a meaningful conversation or even engage each other intellectually. So, busy schedule is one thing. The other thing is communication barrier. If one person or both people in the relationship have poor communication skills, then they can have either like active listening, lack of active listening skills as well. They have the inability to express their thoughts clearly. And so it hinders you being able to stimulate the other person in a conversation or build an intellectual connection. So poor communication skill can also be an hindrance. The other thing that could be an hindrance to cultivating intellectual intimacy is different interests. So if you have a spouse that has different interests from yours, different hobbies, then what ends up happening is you can't find common ground to engage. I would say, as an example, whenever sports, it's time to watch sport, especially during Super Bowl or something, and my husband wants to watch it, truth be told, I've really never bothered myself to learn the rules of the game. I've always just, okay, I'm going to sit down there and have fun watching it with him. But the truth about it is, during that entire time, I don't engage in a conversation with him because sometimes when he's trying to say the rules, I'm like, huh? What? Why? Like, why would anybody do that? Or what's going on? And I can't engage in that way. And truth be told, I've taken a step to try to understand the rules of the game. And just because I'm not interested in it, it's not my cup of tea, I really don't still understand the games. So it's hard to kind of get into an engaging conversation whenever we're watching a particular sports that he's very good at. So those are some things that can happen, communication barrier, different interests, busy schedules. Also, there's fear of judgment, right? So if one or both partners fear being judged or criticized for their opinions, they're going to keep it to themselves. So then they hesitate to share what their thoughts are or openly just get that conversation going. So there's fear of judgment. The other piece I would say that hinder cultivating intellectual intimacy is the lack of curiosity, right? If you are not curious or interested in learning new things, it can prevent partners from engaging in intellectual conversation. They do not stimulate each other. There's no way to explore new ideas together because, again, if you're not curious, I just use sport as an example. I said it's not specific sports, if I would say, it's not my cup of tea, I'm not curious about it, then I'm not going to talk about it, right? So, and then if you think about technology being a distraction also, technology is a great thing, but it could also be a distraction and it could diminish intellectual intimacy in a relationship. So, excessive use of technology, both of you are sitting in the living room, and rather than actually having a conversation with each other, one person is on the phone, the other one is on the laptop, and then before you know it, it continues week over week, day, month, and then you just kind of lose interest in that bonding intellectually. The final hindrance that I'm going to talk about is emotional barrier. And I talked about this in our last episode. When there are emotional issues or unresolved conflicts, it can create that barrier to open communication. And it just prevents you from connecting at an intellectual level. So I would say that watch out for a lot of these hindrances that I just mentioned, because addressing them is going to take an intentional effort. It's not going to be a walk in the park. You have to be intentional, and there needs to be a willingness to prioritize intellectual connection in your marriage. And so look for opportunities to do so. Which brings us to the question of how can you cultivate intellectual intimacy? First, prioritize quality time. Set aside dedicated time each day or the week to engage in that meaningful conversation without distraction. We talked about technology being a distraction. It could really be a distraction. Find that time. It could be over dinner or during a walk or even before bedtime, but you have to prioritize quality time. There's one question that I've had people ask me is, okay, that's all well and good, but I'm busy, and how do I, how do I walk around or compromise on my busy schedule? Because I am really busy. Like I said, we have to be very intentional. Schedule dedicated time. Prioritize that quality time. There's no two ways about it. Despite your busy schedule, you have to prioritize regular time together for meaningful conversation. Even if it's just a few minutes each day, you designate that time. And I know some people like spontaneity. Oh, well, if you're having problem with your busy schedule, then you just have to set aside time. Put it on your calendar if you're a calendar person. Just find that time. The other way you can cultivate intellectual intimacy is ask open-ended questions. We talked about communication. So encourage discussion by asking questions, because sometimes when you ask questions, it helps prompt a thoughtful response or prompt response and deeper exploration of that question, right? Then you get to understand each other's thoughts or ideas. So if you don't know of how to start stimulating that conversations, then think about asking an open-ended question. The other thing is sharing your interests. Sometimes we don't take the time to actually share the best part of our interest and our hobbies. I'll give you an example. I used to make jewelry. Let me not say I used to. I guess due to my busy schedule, I've tapered down from that a little bit. But I love making jewelries. And there are times when I step back and I just want to make my jewelry. And to my husband, it's like, wait, why are you prioritizing that over this right now? But I'll tell you why. I think it took me a while to actually explain to him why I love making jewelries. It wasn't about the jewelry. Like, it really, for me, wasn't about it. Whenever I took those beads and the needle, no matter how tiny those beads were, and I just went through it, it was me concentrating. It was like there was nothing else around. And it was almost like a therapy self-care for me, where I was just relaxing. It was just me and those beads and that needle creating something special. Like, I did not think about my worries, not anything. It was just, that was what I was interested in. And so sometimes we don't share the best part of why we have that interest or that hobby. Now, I used that as an example. But what I also want to say is, if you think about interests, there are times when both partners will never like share the same interests outwardly. So what do you do then? Again, it's communication, sharing your interests. Another example I would give. So I love to ballroom dance. There were a lot of things I loved to do. And whenever I try to get my husband to do it, it wasn't him, right? There was a lot of issues surrounding that, where I'm like, why can't you do what I like? You know how sometimes we want everybody else to compromise, and it's hard for us to compromise because we've lived that life all this while, and it's hard to change, and we just want someone else to fit in. But then eventually, when we stepped back and actually started sharing what are the things that we really like or we enjoyed, what we ended up finding out was this: he has always wanted to learn tennis and play tennis. I know I've always wanted to. I just haven't ever done it. And he had never done it. And just from talking about the things that, what you wish you knew how to do or how you do it. Now we were not talking about what we were actually doing. We're talking about the things that we could have been doing. And so with that, we realized we had a shared interest in tennis. So we went and we registered for a course on tennis. And since then, now we have a shared interest. We actually also play with some of our friends. So please share your interest. The other way you can cultivate intellectual intimacy is reading and learning together. Choose a book or even a podcast, right, on a topic that you both are mutually interested in, and then listen to it together. Stimulate each other in a conversation about the podcast or about the workshop or about the class, about whatever you're learning, and insight and perspective, because one spouse will get a different perspective by listening to the same thing, and the other will get something. Sharing those insights can stimulate those conversations. I would also say attend classes or workshops together, engage in discussions and healthy debates, right? And you got to be careful about that on the debates, and we'll talk about that in a second. The other thing is be open-minded. Approach a conversation with an open mind and the willingness to learn and consider the viewpoint of your spouse. Remember that when you hold an object in front of you, you can't see all the sides and the view of that object. You can only see the side that you're really looking at until you flip it. Now, your spouse might be at the back of that object or on the side of that object, and his view is a little bit different from yours, but you're still looking at the same object. If you're not open-minded, both of you will keep arguing about what that object is or how it looks like or the shape of it, because you're looking at it from different angles. So taking the time to actually approach a conversation with an open mind and trying to be open to different perspective can actually get a holistic picture of the conversation that you're talking about. The other way to cultivate intellectual intimacy is to reflect on your experiences, right? Something like a vacation, some challenges, some memorable moments. Experiences can deepen your connection and understanding of one another. So these are some of the things that you can do to stimulate each other intellectually. And I would say this, if you have communication barriers or unresolved issues that are injuring your intellectual intimacy, you might want to consider seeking guidance from a counselor or just professional help to help you improve your communication skills, because this is key to strengthening your bond, whether it be emotional intimacy or intellectual or even sexual, which we will talk about, or even spiritual. Communication is really necessary in all forms of intimacy. Now, let's talk about some questions that have been asked in the past. How do you disagree to agree? First, let me emphasize the fact that disagreeing to agree is an important skill in any relationship, including marriage, especially when it comes to intellectual matters. So, let's talk about how to effectively do this, because it involves navigating the differences in opinion or perspective so that you can have a mutually acceptable conclusion or a decision. The first thing you want to make sure of is that you identify common goals. This is important because when you do, then you know that you're going to a particular outcome in a conversation. So, understanding what you both want to achieve from a conversation helps you guide that discussion and have a better understanding of motive. So, that's the first piece. Another thing that you want to do is respect each other's perspective. It is okay to have different opinions and viewpoints. So respect your partner's right to their own beliefs and to their own thoughts, even if you don't agree with them. You also have to listen attentively, listen actively. When you're discussing any kind of topic or situation, you want to pay attention to what your partner's perspective is without dismissing their opinion or interrupting. This just helps you get a better understanding of their viewpoint. Which brings me to another thing that you need to do is seek understanding, seek clarity. You have to make an effort to understand why your partner holds that specific viewpoint. It's sometimes better when you ask clarifying questions so that you can gain insights to what motivates them. Another way that you can have a conversation that you disagree with but end up agreeing is to express your thoughts calmly and respectfully. You want to make sure you clearly articulate whatever your viewpoint is. And the best way to do that is using the I statement. Again, talking about how you feel without placing any blame or attack on your partner or any kind of criticism. Another thing I would also say is that you want to find common ground. So find ways within your conversation where you can agree or have shared value. And this is very important. Both of you need to have an understanding of what your shared values are and what your principles are, because when you have conversation, you can always use that to bring back to what exactly this means for both of you. Also, you can also agree on boundaries. So one of the things for me is when things start to get heated up or unproductive during a conversation, how do you step out for a little bit? How do you give yourself space so you can have some form of self-awareness or even just self-reflection on the conversation? Sometimes people might step out, but again, you have to know your partner, because if you step out, they could find it as disrespectful. So ahead of conversations, if you can agree on boundaries, that would help, right? So, like for someone who knows it's better to step out, you can have a conversation about, because I know myself, when things start to get heated, rather than me lashing out, I would rather want to step out. And so you explain that to your spouse. That just gives them a better understanding, because when things starts to get very heated or unproductive and you take that step, it's not news to them. They already know that these are the actions that you would take. So again, agree on boundaries, agree on action steps, and just support each other. The other thing I would also say is that you have to reaffirm your love and commitment within a conversation. You are not each other's enemy. So remind each other that your relationship is based on more than just your shared opinions or your individual opinions. Reaffirm your love and your commitment to each other as you focus on making your relationship better. So that's how I'm going to say you can disagree to agree. The other question I also get is, how do you engage in healthy debates that does not end up causing a conflict? Debates. Well, I would say that that would require communication skills and a mutual respect. Without that, it's going to end up in conflict. So, for healthy debate, you have to establish ground rules, set some clear guidelines for that debate. You have to respect each other's opinion, avoid attacking them personally. You have to focus on what issue you're talking about. Also, use constructive language. You want to make sure you avoid any form of accusatory or any kind of language that would just escalate the tension or the situation going on. Focus on the issue at hand and make sure that you acknowledge valid points. Sometimes we're so quick to criticize, especially whenever the conversation is not going our way. But also when it is going our way, or when they make a valid point, even if you don't agree, but it is a valid point, acknowledge that validity of your partner's argument or their perspective. Because it helps shows that both of you are contributing to the discussion. The other thing is you want to focus on ending on a positive note. So whenever you're having a debate, regardless of whether you resolved it or not, express gratitude for even the ability to have this discussion openly, and try to reaffirm your commitment to working together. Finally, the last question that people ask when we talk about intimacy, and especially in the intellectual concept, like, what if both parties always want to be right? We see that a lot. And I'll tell you, that can strain the relationship. And it hinders even having an effective communication. So how do you go about having communication with your spouse if both of you always want to be right? First of all, I would say that's not healthy. So practice empathy. Make an effort to just understand your partner's perspective and their viewpoint and their emotions, even when you disagree. Empathy, the way I see empathy is that it helps build your connection and soften any desire to always be right. Another thing I would say is choose your battles wisely. It is not every argument that needs to be resolved or turned into a debate. Pick your battles and prioritize what's truly important to both of you. Try to let go of some minor disagreements. It doesn't get you anywhere. But rather focus on solutions. Stay away from trying to prove whether you're right or wrong. If possible, stay away from using the word right or wrong. You're right, you're wrong. And make it more of a collaborative conversation. And then also acknowledge mistakes. Be humble enough to acknowledge when you're wrong, or when you've made a mistake, or when your viewpoint is not in the right direction with your values or your principles as a couple. You want to always focus on that bigger picture, your shared goals, your value, because that's what's going to end up helping the relationship. So these are just some tips for you to help foster that mutual respect and cultivating a healthy relationship, especially when you're having intellectual conversations. All of us just want to be heard. We want to feel heard. We want to feel valued, understood. And so just try practicing some of these tips in your relationship. Well, thank you for tuning in to today's episode on deepening intimacy through intellectual connection. I hope that you've gained valuable insights and some practical ways for you to build intellectual intimacy in your relationship. Remember, fostering intellectual intimacy, it takes time and effort, and you have to be intentional. but the reward in itself, it's going to be worth it. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on future episodes. Share this podcast with those you care about. Your thoughts and questions are like treasures to me, so don't be shy. Drop a message on our social media handle at Intimacy Awakening. We also appreciate your thoughts because we want this conversation to keep going on. You can share topics that you would like us to focus on in the future. So, until next time, when we continue the Deepening Intimacy series, keep loving deeply, communicate, stay true to yourself, and may your relationships be filled with joy, growth, and a beautiful harmony of two unique hearts. I'm your host, Janet Adetunji. Thanks for tuning in.